July 14, 1944, RAF Biggin Hill, Kent. Ground Crew Sergeant Thomas Harwell squinted through the morning haze as Spitfire Mark IX EN398 taxied toward the dispersal area, its Merlin engine ticking as it cooled. The aircraft bore 27 kill markings on its fuselage, more than any other fighter at the station. What caught Harwell's attention wasn't the victory tallies. It was what he saw when the pilot popped the canopy and climbed down. Squadron Leader John, Johnnie Plagis, gestured toward something inside the cockpit, explaining modifications to a visiting American intelligence officer. Harwell moved closer, maintenance checklist forgotten. The reflector gunsight, the critical piece of equipment every fighter pilot relied on to aim his weapons, was mounted backwards. The projection unit faced the wrong direction entirely. Harwell had serviced this Spitfire for 8 months. He'd watched mechanics shake their heads at Plagis's unorthodox installation. He'd heard senior pilots call it bloody dangerous and asking for trouble. The standard Mark II gyro gunsight was sophisticated equipment, computing deflection angles automatically. Mounting it backwards defeated its entire purpose. Yet EN398's kill count kept climbing. 27 confirmed victories, the highest-scoring Spitfire in the squadron, in all of Biggin Hill, actually. And Plagis, a Greek pilot flying for the RAF, had achieved something that seemed impossible. He'd made an equipment failure into an advantage. What Fighter Command would discover about Plagis's modification would challenge decades of aerial gunnery doctrine and force Allied air forces to reconsider everything they thought they knew about deflection shooting. The backwards gunsight wasn't a mistake. It was revolutionary. By mid-1944, the air war over Western Europe had reached a critical phase. Allied fighters had achieved general air superiority, but German pilots, though outnumbered, remained lethally effective when engagements occurred. The kill ratio favored Allied forces, but not by the margins that raw numbers suggested. For every 10 Luftwaffe fighters encountered, Allied squadrons expected to destroy 6 to 7 while losing 2 to 3 of their own. Statistical superiority, certainly. Comfortable superiority? Hardly. The problem wasn't aircraft performance. The Spitfire Mark IX, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin, 66 engine producing 1,120 horsepower, matched or exceeded the Focke-Wulf FW-190 in most flight regimes. The issue was marksmanship. Deflection shooting, firing at a crossing target while accounting for relative motion, bullet drop, and time of flight remained the most difficult skill in aerial combat. RAF training allocated weeks to deflection gunnery, but combat revealed brutal truths. Most pilots never mastered it. Gun camera footage told the story. Analysis of film from successful and unsuccessful engagements showed that pilots achieved hits on crossing targets less than 5% of the time. 5%. That meant 95 rounds fired for every round that struck home, assuming the pilot even got into firing position. The Spitfire's 8.303 Browning machine guns carried only 350 rounds per gun, enough for 16 seconds of continuous fire. Wasted ammunition meant wasted opportunities, and in a dogfight, you rarely got a second chance. The Mark II gyroscopic gunsight, introduced in 1943, promised to solve this problem. Unlike the simple reflector sights of earlier years, the gyro gunsight incorporated a mechanical computer that calculated deflection automatically. The pilot set the target's wingspan using a twist grip, and the sight adjusted the aiming point based on the aircraft's G-forces and turning radius. British engineers had invested thousands of hours perfecting the system. Test pilots praised its accuracy. Combat pilots told a different story. The gyro gunsight required the pilot to maintain precise G-loading throughout the firing pass, smooth, coordinated turns with consistent pull. In actual combat, with FW-190s snapping through vertical reversals and Me-109s diving away at terminal velocity, smooth and coordinated, existed only in training manuals. Real dogfights involved violent maneuvering, blackout-inducing turns, and aircraft shuddering at the edge of stall. The gyrosight's calculations became meaningless when G-forces fluctuated wildly. Pilots who fought over northern France in the summer of 1944 described engagements where they'd line up perfect shots, center the gyrosight's computing reticle on the target, and watch their rounds pass harmlessly behind. The sight calculated deflection based on current turn rate, but combat maneuvering was dynamic. Aircraft accelerated, decelerated, reversed, and rolled unpredictably. By the time the pilot pressed the firing button, the tactical situation had changed. The computer's solution was already obsolete. Squadron commanders knew the statistics. They'd read the after-action reports. They'd attended the tactical briefings where intelligence officers explained deflection theory with diagrams and equations. They'd watched as kill ratios stubbornly refused to improve despite superior equipment and numerical advantage. What they didn't have was a solution that worked in the chaos of actual combat. Most frustrating was the gap between theoretical accuracy and practical results. On the ground, with a stationary sight and a target flying a predictable path, the gyrosight performed flawlessly. In the air, with adrenaline surging and aircraft bucking through turbulence and cannon shells streaming past, pilots reverted to instinct. They ignored the computed solution and aimed where they thought the target would be. Sometimes it worked. Usually it didn't. The RAF needed pilots who could translate theory into results. They needed someone who understood deflection shooting, not as an academic exercise, but as a split-second judgment call made while pulling 4 Gs and watching fuel state drop toward critical. They needed someone who understood that the most sophisticated gunsight in the world meant nothing if it didn't match how pilots actually fought. They had that someone. They just didn't know it yet. Squadron Leader Plagis's approach to aerial gunnery contradicted everything taught at RAF Central Gunnery School. When he first proposed modifying his gunsight, senior pilots at Biggin Hill dismissed the idea as the eccentric notion of a foreign volunteer who didn't understand British engineering. The Mark II gyrosight represented the pinnacle of fire control technology, suggesting improvements, especially improvements that involved mounting components backwards, bordered on insubordination. "The sight does the mathematics for you," one flight commander told him. "Your job is to fly the aircraft smoothly so the computer has consistent data. If you can't do that, the fault isn't with the equipment." Plagis had heard similar assessments throughout his RAF career. As a Greek pilot flying with the British, he occupied an uncomfortable position. The RAF welcomed foreign volunteers. Polish, Czech, Norwegian, and Greek squadrons fought with distinction throughout the war. But acceptance came with expectations. Follow established doctrine, trust British engineering, don't question systems designed by experts who'd spent years developing optimal solutions. The problem was that optimal solutions in peacetime often became deadly compromises in combat. Plagis had flown combat missions since 1941, first in Greece against the Luftwaffe's invasion, then in North Africa, and finally over Western Europe. He'd accumulated deflection shooting experience that most RAF instructors only theorized about. He knew what worked and what didn't, and the gyrosight, despite its theoretical elegance, didn't work the way combat demanded. His kill count should have validated his approach. By spring 1944, Plagis had destroyed 16 German aircraft and damaged several others. His marksmanship exceeded squadron averages significantly. Yet when he proposed sight modifications, superiors attributed his success to luck or exceptional flying skill, not to any flaw in standard equipment. The assumption was clear. If the system worked for everyone else, Plagis should adapt to the system rather than adapting the system to himself. What they couldn't see, what the statistics obscured, was that the system didn't work for everyone else. It worked adequately, producing acceptable results when averaged across hundreds of pilots and thousands of engagements. But acceptable results in aerial combat meant that skilled pilots died because their gun sights led them to aim at empty sky, while enemy fighters escaped, or worse, reversed and counterattacked. German pilots faced similar challenges with their RAF gun sights, but Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized different tactics. German fighters exploited superior diving, speed and climb rate, making slashing attacks rather than sustained dogfights. Their gunnery problem was simpler: lead the target during a high-speed pass, then break away. Allied fighters, particularly Spitfires, had to turn with the enemy. They had to stay in the fight and maneuver for position. That required deflection shooting skills that British training programs struggled to develop. Then came a mission that changed everything, not because Plagis achieved an impossible victory or survived overwhelming odds, but because he made a mistake that revealed the solution to a problem the RAF didn't know existed. Sometimes breakthrough innovations emerge from careful analysis and deliberate experimentation. Sometimes they emerge from accidents. This was an accident. Squadron Leader John Plagis was not an inexperienced pilot when he made the discovery that would transform his effectiveness in combat. Born in Greece, he'd joined the Royal Hellenic Air Force before the war and fought against the Italian invasion in 1940. When Greece fell to German forces in April 1941, Plagis escaped to Egypt and volunteered for the RAF. By 1944, he'd logged over 600 combat hours and held command of a flight in No. 126 Squadron. The modification began as a maintenance error. During a routine gun sight inspection in March 1944, ground crew removed Plagis's Mark II gyro sight for recalibration. When they reinstalled it, they mounted the projection unit 180 degrees, reversed from its proper orientation. The mistake wasn't immediately obvious. The sight still powered on and projected a reticle. But the computing mechanism now received inverted inputs. When Plagis pulled positive Gs, the sight calculated as if he were pushing negative Gs. When he turned right, the computer thought he was turning left. Plagis discovered the error during a training flight. He lined up a simulated deflection shot on a target banner, centered the reticle as doctrine required, and noticed immediately that the computed aiming point felt wrong. Years of combat experience had developed his intuition for deflection angles. The sight was telling him to aim too far ahead. He ignored the computed solution and aimed where his instincts suggested. The practice rounds stitched across the banner perfectly. Back on the ground, mechanics discovered the reversed installation and offered to correct it immediately. Plagis told them to wait. He wanted to fly another training sortie first, this time deliberately using the backward sight in a way that matched his instincts, rather than fighting against them. What he discovered changed his understanding of deflection gunnery entirely. The standard Mark III gyro sight calculated lead angles based on current aircraft motion. If a pilot pulled 3 Gs in a turn, the sight computed how much the aircraft would travel during bullet flight time and adjusted the aiming point forward by that amount. The theory was sound. The problem was that combat maneuvering was predictive, not reactive. Pilots didn't maintain steady turns. They anticipated the enemy's movement and adjusted their flight path continuously to establish firing position. By the time a pilot pressed the trigger, he was already beginning the next maneuver. The reversed sight, fed with inverted G-force data, calculated backwards. It showed where the aircraft had been rather than where it was going. But Plagis discovered that if he used the backwards calculated position as a reference point, and then adjusted his aim based on how he was currently maneuvering, essentially adding his anticipated movement to the sight's historical calculation, he achieved accurate deflection instinctively. It was a revelation. Instead of trusting the computer to solve the equation for him, Plagis used the backwards sight to give him a stable reference frame. His brain handled the predictive calculation, the part that required anticipating how both his aircraft and the target would move in the next half-second. The sight gave him the historical baseline. Together, they created a solution that matched the dynamic reality of dogfighting. The next opportunity to test the modified sight in combat came on April 2, 1944, during a bomber escort mission over northern France. Plagis's flight of 4 Spitfires encountered 6 Focke-Wulf FW-190s attacking a formation of B-17s at 22,000 feet. The German fighters made their initial pass, then reversed hard to break away from the defending escorts. Plagis rolled inverted and pulled through, positioning his Spitfire for a deflection shot as an FW-190 crossed from right to left at 90 degrees angle off. Range 250 yards and closing. The target was pulling perhaps 4 Gs, turning hard to evade. Traditional doctrine said to center the gyro sight reticle and trust the computer. Plagis ignored doctrine. He placed the backwards sight's reticle on the FW-190's trailing edge, then instinctively adjusted his aim forward, not based on the sight's calculation, but based on his own judgment of target motion and his aircraft's current trajectory. His finger squeezed the trigger. 8 .303 Browning machine guns fired in unison, roughly 160 rounds per second combined. The stream of tracers arced across the sky and intersected the FW-190 precisely at its cockpit and engine cowling. The German fighter shuddered. Coolant vapor streamed from its punctured radiator. The FW-190 rolled right, nose down, and began trailing black smoke. Plagis followed through the maneuver, checking 6 o'clock for threats, then swung back to observe. The FW-190 was diving vertically, pilot either dead or unconscious, aircraft streaming fire. It impacted in a French field 12 seconds later. The engagement lasted 18 seconds from initial contact to confirmed kill. Plagis had fired a 3-second burst, roughly 480 rounds total across all 8 guns. Gun camera footage showed hit percentages exceeding 20%. Against a crossing target at combat speeds. That represented extraordinary marksmanship. More importantly, Plagis knew it wasn't luck. The backwards sight had given him exactly the reference frame his brain needed to compute deflection instinctively. He flew 3 more combat missions that week. Each engagement followed the same pattern: position for deflection shot, use backwards sight as stable reference, adjust aim based on predictive judgment, fire short burst, observe hits. By the end of April, Plagis had added 4 more kills to his total, all achieved with exceptional ammunition efficiency. His average burst length decreased to 2.5 seconds. His hit percentage climbed above 15%. In a squadron where most pilots considered 5% accuracy acceptable, Plagis was landing 3 times as many rounds on target. Other pilots noticed. So did squadron commanders. And eventually, so did RAF Fighter Command Headquarters. Fighter Command's response to Plagis's unorthodox modification evolved from skepticism to cautious interest to systematic study. The turning point came when Wing Commander Douglas Bader, himself a tactical innovator and experienced combat leader, reviewed gun camera footage from Plagis's April missions. Bader immediately recognized what the numbers confirmed. Plagis was achieving hit rates that exceeded training standards by margins too large to attribute to pilot skill alone. In May 1944, Fighter Command directed No. 126 Squadron to conduct formal testing. They assigned 2 additional pilots to fly Spitfires with deliberately reversed gun sights. The test parameters were precise: 10 training sorties per pilot against towed banner targets, with half the runs using standard sight orientation and half using the reversed configuration. Results would be compared against the squadron's baseline marksmanship statistics. The initial results surprised everyone. When pilots tried to use the reversed sight exactly as they'd use a standard sight, trusting the computed solution, their accuracy collapsed to near zero. The backwards calculations led them to aim in completely wrong directions. But when instructors taught them Plagis's method, using the reversed sight as a reference frame and adding their own predictive adjustment, something remarkable happened. Pilots who'd struggled with deflection shooting suddenly improved. Not to Plagis's level, certainly. His years of combat experience gave him instincts that couldn't be taught in 10 training flights. But average hit rates improved from 5% to 8%. For pilots with natural deflection instincts, the improvement reached 12 to 14%. The backward sight wasn't making them better shots. It was making their intuitive understanding of deflection more effective by giving them a stable reference point that matched how they actually thought during combat. The technical explanation, when analysts at Fighter Command finally articulated it, was elegant. Traditional gyro sights calculated real-time solutions based on current aircraft state. They told pilots where to aim right now based on right now data. But human reaction time meant that right now was always slightly in the past. By the time visual information reached the brain processed it, and the pilot adjusted his aim. The tactical situation had evolved. Pilots were solving yesterday's equation. The reversed sight, paradoxically, better matched human cognition. It gave pilots historical data, where the aircraft had been a fraction of a second ago, and let them add their own forward-looking adjustment. This 2-step process aligned with how the brain naturally handles prediction tasks. Instead of trusting a black box computer solution, pilots maintained conscious awareness of the calculation. They understood what they were doing and why, which meant they could adapt the technique to different tactical situations. Most critically, the reversed sight worked better during violent maneuvering, when pilots pulled maximum performance turns at the edge of aircraft limits, the exact scenario where gyro sights struggled. The backwards reference frame remained stable. The sight wasn't trying to predict future motion that might change instantly. It was simply recording past motion that had already happened. Pilots could then layer their predictions onto that stable foundation. Wing Commander John Ray, a former Central Gunnery School instructor assigned to evaluate Plagis's technique, wrote in his assessment report, "The reversed sight configuration exploits pilot judgment rather than replacing it. For experienced pilots with developed deflection instincts, this approach yields superior results to computational solutions." Recommendation: authorize voluntary adoption by pilots, demonstrating appropriate skill levels. Fighter Command didn't mandate the reversed sight for all pilots. The modification required too much individual skill and judgment to work as a universal solution, but they authorized squadron commanders to permit the modification for pilots who demonstrated aptitude. By July 1944, 12 Spitfire pilots at Biggin Hill flew with reversed sights. Their collective kill count climbed steadily. Plagis's Spitfire EN398 led them all. Between April and September 1944, Squadron Leader Plagis and Spitfire EN398 compiled a combat record that ranked among the most impressive of any fighter-pilot aircraft pairing in RAF service. The final tally reached 31 confirmed aerial victories, plus 7 probable kills and 14 damaged enemy aircraft. EN398 survived the war without suffering major battle damage. a statistical improbability given its combat intensity. Plagis's personal contribution extended beyond his own victories. He spent hours teaching deflection techniques to younger pilots, explaining how to use the reversed sight as a reference frame rather than a computational solution. His methods influenced tactical training throughout fighter command. By late 1944, gunnery instructors were teaching Plagis's technique as an advanced deflection shooting method. Though most training aircraft retained standard sight orientation, the broader impact on fighter doctrine came from what Plagis's success revealed about the relationship between human judgment and computational assistance. Post-war analysis showed that the most effective combat pilots, regardless of nationality, shared a common trait. They used their gun sights as tools that enhanced their judgment rather than as automated systems they trusted blindly. German aces interviewed after the war described similar approaches with their RAF sights. They learned to feel the correct lead angle and used their sights to confirm their instincts. This insight influenced post-war fighter development significantly. When the U.S. Navy began developing the AN/APG-30 radar-directed gun sight for jet fighters in the late 1940s, designers incorporated lessons from Plagis's experience. The new sight provided targeting data but required conscious pilot interpretation. It was a tool for decision support, not a replacement for pilot judgment. Similar philosophy guided the development of the British Air Pass computing sight and later systems. Plagis himself survived the war and returned to Greece, where he continued flying with the Hellenic Air Force until 1952. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross twice and the Distinguished Service Order for his combat leadership. In interviews decades later, he downplayed the significance of his modified gun sight. "The sight was just a piece of equipment," he said in a 1983 interview. "What mattered was understanding deflection shooting deeply enough that you could aim without thinking. The sight helped with that. But the skill came from experience." EN398 survived the war and was eventually scrapped in 1947 during post-war demobilization. No one thought to preserve the aircraft with the highest kill count in its squadron. The only surviving evidence of its service is gun camera footage and maintenance logs documenting its 27 confirmed victories. Historians later revised the total upward to 31 after reviewing additional combat reports. The irony is inescapable. The RAF invested thousands of engineering hours perfecting a gyroscopic computing sight designed to automate deflection shooting. A Greek pilot turned it backwards and proved that human judgment, properly supported, exceeded computational solutions. Sometimes the most sophisticated answer isn't the correct answer. Sometimes the correct answer is simpler, stranger, and far more effective. Innovation rarely emerges from following established procedures. It emerges from individuals who understand systems deeply enough to recognize when those systems fail to match reality. Plagis didn't reject British engineering expertise or dismiss the value of computational fire control. Recognized that the gyro sight solved the wrong problem. It calculated precise solutions to simplified equations when combat demanded approximate solutions to complex dynamic problems. His insight reveals a broader truth about human-machine interaction. The most effective tools don't replace human judgment, they enhance it. They provide information that helps skilled operators make better decisions faster. When tools try to replace judgment entirely, they fail in situations where their underlying assumptions don't hold. Combat aviation is full of such situations. So is life. The backwards gun sight forced pilots to think about what they were doing. It made deflection shooting a conscious skill rather than an automated response. That consciousness, that engagement with the problem made pilots better, not just more accurate, but more adaptable. They understood why they aimed where they aimed, which meant they could adjust their technique when circumstances changed. one maintenance error, one pilot willing to question doctrine, one Spitfire that became the highest-scoring fighter in its squadron. The story isn't about equipment or technology. It's about the irreplaceable value of human expertise and the courage to trust your judgment when everyone else says you're wrong. Sometimes backwards is forward.